This Power Perspective, Empowering Black-Owned Businesses, is sponsored by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. Please welcome the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Metro Detroit Black Business Alliance, Charity Dean.
Thank you. So I heard this quote, and it said, "For only the one that attempts the absurd can achieve the impossible." And so when I heard that quote, I immediately thought about Detroit. That's what we do in Detroit, right? We attempt the absurd. Let me give you an example, right? A white man from Livonia launches a write-in campaign for mayor of Detroit and wins, right? Absurd, impossible. That was my former boss, so it's okay. The city, the largest city in US history to file for municipal bankruptcy, then becomes named by Time Magazine as one of the 50 greatest places in the world. Absurd. It's impossible. Could a city that's also coming out of bankruptcy, trying to do development, also coexist with the community benefits ordinance? And now you've got developers and community coming together to thrive in downtown? It's absurd. Impossible. Could the Detroit Lions win the 2023? Okay, wait, it's too early for that. It's early. But the point is that what might seem absurd to others is not to Detroiters. We are used to that. So what seems like it's impossible is actually intentional. It takes intention for these things to happen. So there's a great poet from Detroit, his name is Big Sean. He said, "I started from the basement and I made it to the skyscrapers." And that's what I think about when I think about Detroit, right? When you look downtown and you look downtown Detroit, it doesn't look like it looked 10 years ago, right? And we've talked about it all day, right? We heard the announcement after announcement. Corporations, headquarters moving to downtown Detroit. And a vacant train station is now an innovation hub for mobility. We see Little Caesars Arena, which brought millions of dollars of revenue to the city of Detroit, thousands of jobs, and hopes to a Detroiter like me for bringing the Pistons home. We've seen all of this happen in 10 years since bankruptcy. Impossible, right? No, intentional. Intentional partners, intentional government coming together to make this happen. And yet throughout all of these announcements, something was missing. So even amongst everything that's happening downtown Detroit, in a city where 75% of the population is Black, less than 10% of the businesses downtown are Black. Less than 3% of the buildings that are owned in downtown Detroit are owned by Black people in a Black city. So to understand why, we kind of have to understand a systemic issue that is at play. And this systemic issue plagues our country, it plagues our state, it plagues our city, it plagues downtown. We have a racial wealth gap. Well, what is the racial wealth gap, Charity? So glad you asked me. Well, what that means is that a white family and a Black family with the same income, same education, your Black family is gonna have 9 times less the wealth of the white family. And how did we get there? Thank you for asking. So we live in a country where after centuries of slavery, we had state, federal, and local policies that intentionally discriminated against Black people. And so we're talking about wealth, we're talking about capital, we're talking about assets, we're talking about land. Ooh, it got quiet in here, I know. Where did Antoine say we was at church? It got real quiet in here. But it's true, right? I didn't make this up, guys. This is the truth. We have a racial wealth gap in our country, in our state, in our city, and it's downtown Detroit. And in fact, these policies of redlining that we talk about, which was legal discrimination that prohibited Black people from acquiring land, that did not we didn't get rid of redlining till the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So I'm going to tell you a story. My great-grandmother, who would have been 100 years old today, her name is Rosa. She was the second black family to integrate the Rosedale Park neighborhood. She integrated the Rosedale Park neighborhood, not in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. In 1973, she was the second black family. So when we talk about the racial wealth gap, I have to imagine how much generational wealth my family is missing had we been allowed to access land decades before, generations before, centuries before. And yet here we are. And it happened even here downtown Detroit, right? Not far from here, an area called Black Bottom, where black homeowners and black business owners lived, thriving businesses. Something happened in the 50s and 60s. Our government policies continue to widen this wealth gap. You guys say, that's impossible. It was intentional. And so what happened? Well, we thought it would be a really great idea to have 375 in an area that was thriving with black-owned businesses and black entrepreneurship and black people. And so the folks were gone, they're gone, and now there is a freeway there that is pretty soon going to be turned into a development. But what happened to all those people? And what happened to all those businesses? So I'm talking about the past, not to get it quiet in here. You guys can like drink your water and stuff. But I don't talk about the past to startle us. We have to understand it to understand why we're here today. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about the future, right? We're here to talk about the future of downtown. And so Martin Luther King, we're going to celebrate him on Monday. He said this: if a man enters a race 300 years after another man, the first would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up. So we think about that wealth gap that I'm talking about. How do we catch up? Well, Martin Luther King says we have to do something impossible. Well, that's good news for Detroit because that's what we do, right? That is what we do in Detroit, right? We attempt the absurd in order to achieve the impossible. So there's another great Detroit poet. I'm going to get to her in a minute, but it's not just me that has identified this. And in fact, 5 years ago, the Kellogg Foundation did a report. It's called The Business Case for Racial Equity. Let me see if you've seen this report. It was released 5 years ago. 5 years ago, Kellogg Foundation, Business Case for Racial Equity. Not only is this racial wealth gap hurting us in Michigan because it's morally wrong, it's costing us money. $92 billion are at stake. In fact, they said if we close the wealth gap, as we're thinking about the future of downtown, if we close this wealth gap, the state of Michigan stands to gain $92 billion. So we have an economic imperative to get moving and get moving fast. So this Detroit poet, Cash Dow, said, you want me to take you serious, you gotta show me something. And thankfully, the Kellogg Foundation is a fan of Cash Dow, and they did. They said, okay, here's what's going on in Michigan, and here's what we have to do. And so they released this report. Please look at it because we're 5 years behind. They released this report, and they said, okay, not only do we have this wealth gap, and here's how we're gonna close it. We gotta do this in education. We gotta do this in criminal justice. But when it comes to entrepreneurship, we have to do the impossible. We need access to capital for minority entrepreneurs. And I stand to you today and say, we need access to capital for those minority entrepreneurs, black businesses in our state, in our city, in downtown. And so another great Detroit poet said, if you only had one shot, one opportunity, I could rap it, but I want to keep you here, to seize everything you ever wanted, one moment, would you capture it? Or would you let it slip? So that's my question to you. If you, where you are standing right now, had one opportunity to help close this wealth gap, if you could do anything from the organizations that you represent, whoever brought you here, who paid for your ticket, whether it was you or someone else, if you could do one thing to help rectify the situation that happened right here downtown in Black Bottom, if you could do one thing to help us close this wealth gap so that we could generate $92 billion for our state, would you do something about it? Would you do something absurd? And then I will say to you, we have an opportunity. We have more than one opportunity. We have 2 opportunities, 3 opportunities, 4 opportunities to do something about it. And so as I begin to think, what is something absurd that we could do? Could we ask every single developer to contribute to a racial equity fund to help close this wealth gap? Could we ask every organization represented here to donate to a 0% loan interest fund for Black businesses to be in Detroit? Could we do reduced rent for tenants? Could we reach out to every entrepreneur that was in Black Bottom and the descendants of those entrepreneurs and homeowners that were in Black Bottom and give them the first opportunity to purchase land or to occupy spaces for businesses? And we can, because that's what we do in Detroit. We attempt the absurd, and so then we will be like these great poets, these great Detroit poets. And I say that every single one of you in here can join me and dream the impossible. We can follow the star no matter how far. We can do what's right without hesitation, without pause, without thinking about it. We can come together. We can attempt the absurd, and the world, Detroit, downtown Detroit, will be better for it. And if we're lucky, we just might achieve the impossible. Thank you.